To begin that discussion, I'd like to introduce Jason Mellad. Jason is the Chief Executive Officer and founder of Start Codon, an accelerator in the UK. And I will, rather than reading you his bio, I'll refer you again to the briefing book where you can read more about Jason. And Jason, take it away.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you, everyone. I think you really nicely set up the talk that I'm going to give in my portion. And I wanted to kind of put some provocative thoughts out there. I mean, I am admittedly a first-time investor in the sense that I've just raised a fund to invest in what we consider to be early stage and exciting startups in the therapeutics and diagnostics and early detection field. And although I'm based in the UK, we're backed by major pharma. And so I always have a lookout for what I feel that some of our partners are most intrigued by. And oddly enough, it is not just the classic R&D pipelines for new target, new drug. A lot of it comes down to patient care and patient management and biomarkers and early detection, things that were touched on by both Russ and by Susan. So I just wanted to throw a couple of thoughts out there from what I'm seeing on what I consider to be really the cutting edge, the earliest stages of investment when things are the riskiest, but in many cases the most exciting, and how that might translate into the development of novel therapies and ways of managing chronic diseases. So there's a really interesting conundrum. If you look at the figures for the unmet need and the size of market for most chronic diseases, you would actually think on the surface that it's an ideal space for us to be operating in. But then the question is, why is everybody so obsessed with oncology when we know that there's far more patients out there suffering from these chronic diseases? There are multiple patients, you can see from this data from the NCOA in individuals over the age of 65 in the States. More than 50%, more than 60% of individuals have 2 or more chronic conditions that could be treated. So you're looking at a captive patient population that is woefully underserved and should be the dream of any pharma, any biotech, any investor to pursue. And yet, consistently, they do not. So I have a couple of hypotheses about why that may be. And I think a lot of it comes down to risk aversion. This kind of attitude that you're once bitten, twice shy. I see it all the time from the partners that we speak with when we're out there deal sourcing, and indeed when we're trying to perform diligence to what we see as exciting opportunities. Oh, there's a new way of detecting Alzheimer's earlier. There's a better way of addressing these ophthalmology disorders for some of the reasons that Susan highlighted. And occasionally there is some enthusiasm, but too often people go, oh, type 2 diabetes, I'm not really sure about that. Or neurodegenerative, yes, we've tried that before. When we had a program in that space, but we dropped it, so we're not really interested. And it's really fascinating to me to try to dig into why that is. I think fundamentally we're all familiar with the translational research bottleneck. Billions and billions of dollars are spent per year investigating not only oncology, but a lot of these chronic diseases that we're going to be speaking about during the course of this program. And yet the majority of the therapies fail for a variety of different reasons, but there's a quite sudden narrowing of the bottleneck when it comes to all the programs that are funded to the ones that actually make it through the clinical trial to even, as we know, far less, something like 0.1% that actually make their way into the clinic and then hopefully lead to the positive patient outcomes that we're expecting and actually manage to secure the reimbursement that allows pharma companies not only to repay their development costs, but encourage them to continue to producing more products in the pipeline. Unfortunately, a lot of these projects fail for a variety of different reasons, often related to side effects that weren't anticipated, low tolerability, etc. Things that I think today we can circumnavigate and actually solve in a way that will encourage more investment in chronic disease-focused startups. So I just want to throw a couple of hypotheses out there based upon my most recent experience. So the first one is that when it comes to healthcare, it is increasingly personal. This idea that we are going to become more narrow and narrowly focused on what we as individuals can benefit most from when it comes to therapies is really being embraced across the industry. And increasingly, I'm finding companies that I'm trying to invest in myself and seeing getting investment traction from the VC community that are focused on enabling that hyper-personal healthcare. I would say that the rare disease industry has actually pioneered in this space. It went from rare diseases being underserved to suddenly rare diseases because of orphan indication being quite attractive and finding that sweet spot. But a large part of that was creating the infrastructure required to be able to address narrower and narrower populations. So within the chronic diseases, a lot of times we mislabel or miscategorize, and you start to think, well, within, say, the atherosclerosis bucket, there's subtypes of subtypes of subtypes. And if you have to address those subtypes, there has to be a way to effectively do so without making it once again appear unattractive. When your addressable market appears to shrink, you have to convince an investor to back a company really fine-tuning their approach to those narrowly defined populations, and also the payer providers who are willing to reimburse whatever therapy or diagnostic they produce. So throughout my presentation, I'll highlight a couple of interesting companies that I think are really starting to pioneer in the space. Platomics, off of the back of 23andMe and other personalized genetics testing, is really trying to democratize genomics when it comes to personal care. Axial 3D is really fascinating in the fact that they are printing 3D constructs to help surgery for individual patients, for example. It's a really exciting space. And Enhanced Genomics is a company out of the UK, which is using functional genomics to identify novel druggable pathways for chronic diseases. There have been so many genome-wide association studies that have been performed that haven't translated into actual therapeutic targets, let alone therapies in the clinic. So you can imagine for every cardiovascular, metabolic, or neurodegenerative genome-wide association study, up to 90% of the hits identified are in non-coding genes. So we're sitting on a treasure trove of novel genes and pathways that could be targeted to treat these disorders, but they haven't been able to be translated into viable drug targets. Companies like Enhanced Genomics have found ways to actually unlock that information, and I think that's going to engender a renaissance when it comes to new disease targets. Now, we all know that cancer has dominated the field, but it's clear that for every disorder that we're facing, chronic or otherwise, that there's an innovation trinity: early detection, prevention, and cure. And so looking at what we would say has the field that has really led the way from an investor perspective for demonstrating why early detection is such a powerful place and worthy of investment is cancer. So in this diagram, we're looking at 5-year survival rates on the y-axis, and on the x-axis, we're looking at the cumulative percentage of people who have been diagnosed. So essentially, what you're seeing is that for these 4 cancers, pancreatic, lung, ovarian, and prostate, early detection saves lives. Now, how does this translate into investment? The likes of Exact Sciences, which took several decades before they were able to develop their Cologuard test, really demonstrated that early detection of population screening could be a viable and really attractive investment prospect. Their Cologuard test, you are shipped the container at home, you collect your own stool sample and ship it to a centralized facility for testing, and they have revolutionized early detection of colorectal disease and potentially other gastrointestinal disorders like IBS and IBD. Now, what's important about this is that this company, off of the back of their first flagship test, is now at a market cap of $24 billion, which is very attractive. So increasingly, I see investors always asking, to Russ's point, what about early detection of chronic disease X? Can I find early biomarkers? Can I find stratification? Can I differentiate between IBS and IBD? Can I detect Alzheimer's early? And if I do, what do I do about it? But there's now really clued into this idea of early detection and biomarkers for developing and identifying novel pathways to treat those patients. Because if you can detect it early, you can also start to stratify more effectively and discover the different subtypes of disease. A similar vein is a company based in the UK, because I'm trying to bridge both worlds, called Cytosponge. So they are collaborating with Medtronic to commercialize a sponge that you swallow as a pill, and then you pull it back from your GI tract, and it actually samples all along your esophagus for early detection of cancer, but also other diseases. So individuals who are suffering from GERD or acid reflux are at much higher risk of esophageal cancer and other complications. So this test allows you to better stratify those patients for therapy with proton pump inhibitors and other interventions, but also detect cancer early. So again, early detection of cancer is leading the way. Now in the chronic disease space, you can look at disorders like familial hypercholesterolemia. This is based off of a recent report in JAMA 2017 showing that over 1 million Americans are suffering from familial hypercholesterolemia, putting them at far greater risk of heart disease, and yet over 90% have not been diagnosed. So imagine if we had widespread screening for familial hypercholesterolemia, this chronic disease that underpins cardiovascular disorders that can be detected from as early as birth, that we could have interventions early on and better stratify patients when they present to the clinic for therapies. I would say that where genetics and epigenetics underpinning most chronic diseases, there's a lot of room for improvement in biomarkers. I'm going to switch tack now and talk about underserved populations and equity, diversity, and inclusion, which I personally believe is going to be one of the most disruptive set of innovations of the 21st century. This is some data from the FDA, and they're now annually produced drug trial snapshots summarizing 2015 to 2019. And what you can see is that although we are improving overall in terms of the percentages of male and females who are in clinical trials, and race distribution needs to improve as well as age distribution, we are getting better, but there's still severely unaddressed populations when it comes to clinical trials, as well as preclinical development pathways. So it's not just enough to find the individuals to be in your trial once you've got a drug that's ready to go to market or a diagnostic. You need to also be thinking about that when it comes to the biomarker discovery or therapeutic discovery upstream in the preclinical phase. Getting access to those samples, getting access to those populations is going to be key. You can see here, for example, in the race distribution over that 5-year period, that only 7% of clinical trials in aggregate included Black or African-American patients in terms of the distribution of patients, rather, compared to a population of 13-14%. So there's a disproportionate balance when it comes to these trials that needs to be addressed. And there are several companies that are receiving and the interests of investors who are trying to address this problem, not only from the recruitment of patients for clinical trials like Egality, also companies like Hurdle, which are trying to manage patient care for underserved populations as well. Now, the importance here is that you can build off of the data and interactions that these companies are going to be leading to better identify patients, but also gain access to data that will help you identify novel pathways. Chronic disease management as a whole, I think, is going to be key. Tech-enabled management is going to really open the doors when it comes to addressing these populations and identifying, once again, novel target biomarkers. The two go hand in hand. So I hope you can understand there's a theme. When I'm looking for opportunities for investment, I'm always thinking not only about the need that these companies are solving today, but also how can they pivot in the future when they build those informed, consented databases of information, which will be valuable. How can they partner with pharma to leverage that information to identify these novel pathways and also better stratify patients? And finally, I just want to leave a recent case study that I thought was quite fascinating. Off of the back of not only pulse ox being important for the likes of chronic diseases like COPD, but importantly also for COVID-19, there are numerous devices that can be used at home for monitoring your blood oxygen levels. But it turns out that individuals who have darker skin tones, so African Americans and certain Southeast Asian populations, for example, may not have the most accurate readings with these pulse ox. Now, if you take it that African Americans are 3 times more likely to suffer a poor outcome from COVID, and if pulse ox machines are being used at home to monitor their oxygen levels, but they're not quite as accurate, you can imagine how that's going to exacerbate the issue. So this is one of those kind of disparities that we have to think about when it comes to the tech we're using as well. It's not just access to the tech or access to the drugs, it's how they were developed and how they address the needs of a diverse population. Something for us all to think about. So those are the points I wanted to leave you with, and really looking forward to the broader discussion. So thank you.